Hi everyone, I'm Stephen Downs. Welcome once again to Ethics, Analytics, and the Duty of Care. We're in Module 6, which is focused on the duty of care. We've already looked at that concept as a legal concept, and now we're going to do a fairly extensive look at the ethical concept of care, and that's the core of this module. And to be quite honest, I've kind of put off talking about this because I wanted to get it right, and it's going to be hard for me to get right. And in fact, I'm going to need to begin with some caveats that I think it's important that we keep in mind. One thing is that, well, look at me. The ethics of care is a new philosophy. I was commented earlier today that it didn't really exist when I was going to school or even when I was teaching philosophy. It's something that really only came into being as a widespread and well-known philosophy after I had started in the field of online learning. So there's that. Also kind of male, and yet the ethics of care are typically associated with women, with a feminist epistemology and a feminist perspective. And, I don't want to be the man who sits down here and explains to women what their thought is. I think that would be a bad plan for a variety of reasons. But I have more caveats as well. I notice this, most of the people that I'm quoting in this section, although I've tried to take a wider perspective, but certainly most of the leading voices in this section are American. And of course, I live in North America. I'm Canadian, so of course we're completely different. Nonetheless, it doesn't represent as much as I would like the voices of people, and of women in particular, from places like Africa and South America and Asia, even Europe to some degree. So I think there's a scope for a wider investigation that I can offer here. A lot of the people that I quote as well come from leading academic institutions. Did a check again earlier today, and they're coming from Harvard, Stanford, Princeton, and they're going to talk about oppression. And it's hard for me to wrap my head around the idea of people from Harvard, Stanford, and Princeton talking about oppression. But then again, I'm sure it's hard for a lot of people to look at a cisgendered old white male from Canada talking about oppression. So, I get that. And as I'm sure they would say, I will say, I can't help being who I am. And I'm going to do this subject the most justice that I can. And I'm presenting it a bit differently than we'll see in a lot of presentations. The online encyclopedias covering care theory, or the books, and I did consult that and other books on this. I've got a whole digital library now on care theory. Generally, you get a presentation where it goes, Gilligan, Noddings, Joan Toronto, bell hooks, and presents them as, like Locke, Berkeley, Hume, as if they're presenting each, a distinct and independent theory and arguing with each other about what that should be. And I don't really read that at all. That's not to say that they don't have their own perspectives. Absolutely they do. And these perspectives really shine through clearly, and they're coming from different places, obviously. But I felt that it would be a more appropriate treatment to think of an ethic of care as an undifferentiated whole, and these authors as representing different aspects of it, rather than as arguing among each other about what it should be. I think that might be more true to the ethic itself, and it's more true to my enterprise, certainly. And again, all of these authors are still with us. I checked. Some of them are very old, but nonetheless, they can tell you what they think better than I can. Again, no debating that, obviously. So what you're getting here isn't me explaining them to them and people like them. This is very much an interpretive exercise. This is the ethics of care as seen from my perspective, from the specific context of this project, which is to look at ethics and analytics and AI within the field of learning. And so, and there's discussion of that in these authors as well, but I come from that kind of background as well, and so I think that seeing their work from this perspective can be valuable. And even if it isn't, that's what I'm doing. and we'll all have to live with that, I guess. So I wanted to throw these contexts in. Previously in this course, I've said, like I'm an analytic. I'm not a very good analytic, but I'm coming from a tradition where you can't just hand wave. Slicing things into categories doesn't cut it as thinking. We want to talk about causes. We want to talk about how things happen, and I'm still going to carry this approach into care theory as well. But I'm going to try to interpret it and evaluate it very much on its own merits. Because although I sound skeptical starting off like this, I also want to say I agree with most of it. Not all of it. They don't all agree among themselves, right? So, but, I think they're on to something. I think that what they're talking about is important and reflective of a lot of the work that I've done over the years. Now, whether I've been influenced by them, I couldn't say. I won't say that I sat down and read feminist philosophy before working on MOOCs. That would be a lie. But, maybe voice to voice to voice to voice, what they said influenced me. Or more likely, what people who influenced them said also influenced me, perhaps through a different channel. No matter. It doesn't really matter. But in the end, I do agree with a lot of that, and I'm going to make it reasonably clear, I think, where I'm finding a consistency between the ethics of care and the work that I've done over the years. So that's the caveats, and we're 8 minutes into this, but these were important things to say. Now, let's ask as well, I'm going to talk about what care is, so obviously, but I want to ask some questions first to set up this inquiry. And we're setting it up from the perspective of artificial intelligence and analytics in learning. So we're going to need to ask things like, how can neurons care? Is caring driven by evolution? And if so, is it a cultural evolution or a biological evolution? I know, nature versus nurture. I'm not going to dive into the nature versus nurture question, but it's going to come up. Does caring depend on rules and rationality? And even then, if we're going to talk like that, what do rules and rationality even look like? Does caring require attachment? We'll see in our discussion that has a lot to do with connection and relationship. But how does that cash out exactly? What do we mean by that? So these are some of the questions I have in the back of my mind as we begin this inquiry. Okay, so let's just acknowledge right off the top that care has many meanings. It's a word that is commonly used in our society. And I'll quote here from Joan Tronto. When we say cares and woes, care denotes a burden. When we say I care for you, we express love. Care always expresses an action or a disposition, a reaching out to something. When we use it to refer to ourselves, as in, I take good care of myself, we are in that instant thinking of ourselves as both the doer and that toward which we are reaching out. Care expresses relationships. It is used to express our deepest convictions, as when we say, I care about dolphins. It is used by advertisers in banal ways to make us like a company and perhaps continue to buy its products, as when we hear advertisers say, McDonald's cares. What's important here is that all these different meanings of care aren't presented to us like a menu or a buffet from which we choose one or two. I mean, the word has many meanings and many dimensions of meanings for a reason. The concept that it's trying to get at has all of these different shades and nuances. And I think that's one of the things that really struck me in this particular investigation is, how complex a concept it is. We've looked at concepts like duty, we've looked at concepts like utility and happiness, and there are shades of nuance in those as well. This one reaches, I think, a bit deeper into the nuance, and that might make it more useful. On the other hand, it makes it more hand-wavy, and we're going to need to be careful, and I'm going to be careful to draw out all of these different meanings, all of these different flavors. And again, it won't be like we're going to pick 1, 2, and 3 and say these are the essential things of care, because I don't think it's that kind of concept. So the concept of care itself predates, of course, the ethics of care and a lot of the discussion of care as a particularly feminist philosophy, as we'll talk about later. I found this short, but at the time very popular work by Milton Mayer entitled On Caring, talking about to care for another person is, in the most significant sense, to help him grow and actualize himself. You can tell that that's pre-feminist writing just by the way that that's expressed, right? It's a process, a way of relating to someone that involves development, in the same way that friendship can only emerge in time through mutual trust and a deepening and qualitative transformation of the relationship. So, the idea here is of mutual growth, mutual development, the element of relationship. This exists in care even before it becomes a feminist philosophy. Mayeroff continues in his non-gender neutral language. In the context of a man's life, caring has a way of ordering his other values and activities around it. There's a basic stability in his life. He is in place in the world instead of being out of place or merely drifting or endlessly seeking his place. So, care here is tied to identity. It's tied to value. You can see how it becomes the basis for an ethic. But it is something that existed prior to the 1980s when people started writing about this. And it existed prior to Milton Mayer, and we could go through a whole etymology of the word care and the different flavors of care through history. So, but there's nothing wrong with that. I've always said everything I ever talk about is stolen from somewhere else. And I can probably be a bit kinder to the writers of the ethics of care. But I do want to talk about the idea, or I do want to stress the idea that they're drawing from a pre-existing concept here. And also, importantly, a context that informed them in their own lives and in their own philosophical development. Since then, there has been a proliferation of writing about care and care ethics. And I drew this from Maria Puig de la Bella Casa, who wrote Matters of Care in 2017. And I've got links here, just as an aside, full text PDFs for a lot of these important reference works exist online, unlike a lot of the other branches of philosophy. And so where I found them and was able to download them and read them, I've indicated here as well on the slides. And if you actually access the slides or download them, you'll be able to click on these links and read these full-length presentations. So anyhow, De la Bella Casa mentions a bunch of different domains where care ethics have been explored, including critical psychology, political theory, justice, citizenship, scientific choices for development, technoscience, knowledge and science, animal rights, food politics, ecology, and many, many more. There is a huge amount of writing in care ethics. I'm only summarizing the very surface of it, the very perhaps leading edges of it. So we need to keep that in mind as well. Again, a lot of nuance. This is typical, right? And it's something I've noticed in other domains of inquiry, not just in philosophy, not just in ethics, but around any idea, a whole community will develop and a whole bunch of different strands and flavors will develop. Technology, look at, we started with the web, simple HTML, and we got this huge complex thing that we have now. Any domain you think of starts out simple, starts out pretty clear, really gets complex, and it only takes a generation or two for that to happen. And we're only a generation or so into discussion of care ethics. I once did an analysis of René Descartes, and again, after Descartes, you see this flood of rationalist philosophy just flower up behind him. So some dimensions of care, again, not definitive, nor a menu. You don't pick and choose. You don't say this thing is part of empathy, this thing is part of equity. All of these dimensions are going to be present in any instance or practical application of care. But there are words you've heard in the media a lot recently. Empathy, social justice, equity, cultural responsiveness, inclusion, empowerment. All of these are things that we've seen. Of course, there's always someone who wants to assess all of these, and so I've linked here to a document, Quis, Hesselink, and Gustafsson, asking, can quality from a care ethical perspective be assessed, a review? And they've broken it down to antecedents of the relationship looking for the logic of the patient, fit, and then finally good care. And again, these are aspects or dimensions of care, flavors of care. Even that's not quite right. Imagine care as being a many-colored ball. These are some of the different colors of that ball. Types of care. I found this discussed to some degree. Again, I'm not sure how much this helps us, but but it's certainly worth drawing out because different authors have emphasized different aspects of care. So some of the types of care, one that certainly resonates with me is care for ideas. If I didn't care about care, for example, I wouldn't have spent nearly the amount of effort that I have on it. We certainly see people care for objects. I care for my computer, and my computer cares for me. Well, maybe not, but people do care for objects. They think of their cars as like people and name them. There's care for other people, obviously, and there's care for animals. There's self-care or care for ourselves, care for what happens to us, what happens after we die, for example. There's care expressed as protection, care expressed as production. Now, Toronto talks about protection and production as being, quote, passes. And the idea here is that you get to pass on care, other kinds of care, if you're protecting. You get to pass on other kinds of care or responsibility for other kinds of care if you're a producer. And that's not a good notion. I mean, it's not clear that just because you're in protection or just because you're in production, you're not bound by responsibilities of other sorts of care. Of course, what we mean by that we'll have to draw out and explain to some degree. Toronto says what it means to be a citizen in a democracy is to care for citizens and to care for democracy itself. So our care can extend to our society and indeed, to the environment as a whole, to the ecology, to the planet as a whole, possibly for the universe as a whole. And if you're religious, it can be care for God or care about God or Allah or Vishnu, etc. All of these are aspects of human care. If you're wondering about the image on the slide, it's interesting because this aspect is sort of reflected in Robert A. Heinlein. This is a set of excerpts from, or a set of images from the movie Starship Troopers, which is his book. It's hard to read, but I'll read it. What's the moral difference, asks the instructor, if any, between a citizen and a civilian? Now, this is a meme, so we got a parody answer. A citizen returns the cart without any legal obligation. A civilian does not. The instructor responds, exact words of the text. But you get the concept, right? And someone who cares is more like, on this interpretation, a citizen. Someone who doesn't care in this context is more like a civilian. Now, there's a lot of discussion on the boards about whether this representation of Heinlein is satire or not, and indeed whether Heinlein himself is satirizing or not. Heinlein is an interesting and complex author, but there is this shared idea between Heinlein and the ethics of care, of having a responsibility to those around yourself, and that responsibility as distinguishing someone who is ethical, a citizen, from someone who is not, a mere civilian. Care has been one of these things, though. I mean, it's interesting to draw this distinction between Heinlein and the discussion of care, because Heinlein doesn't talk about care properly so called. He talks about duty and honor and things like that. And historically, care hasn't had the same place as part of social activity that other things have. And we'll look at some of these other things. And Noddings talks about these things as being marks of personhood. And she says, and I quote, "If we decide that the capacity to care is as much a mark of personhood as reason or rationality, then we will want to find ways to increase this capacity." And as well, the experience of caregiving, both as a carer and a recipient, is essential for this. So these are things that we're going to explore, themes we're going to explore more in this presentation. But there is this idea, we can come up with this idea of, the way people have defined being a person as being rational. Homo sapiens, the rational animal. Maybe there's a sense of humans as the caring animal. I don't know what that would be in Latin. So, Homo carianus. Sorry, I suppose I could look it up. And now, of course, caring does not distinguish humans from non-humans. Perhaps, arguably, non-humans care, but we could draw out this idea of caring as indicating personhood, just as we could draw out this idea of reasoning indicating personhood, or tool use indicating personhood, or language use indicating personhood. It could be thought of as part and parcel of that. And that's kind of important, because it wasn't until recently that women were considered persons. And the sorts of reasoning and the sorts of mental processes that they would typically be responsible for weren't considered marks of personhood. And I think that's a big part of the shift that's taken place since the 1980s, as we began to think more and more of women as persons, which, just as an aside, was long overdue. Also, more and more, we began to think of the way they look at the world as being part of personhood. I think there's a relationship between there. Certainly, the suggestion in the writing is that there is such a relationship. Care as well, and we're running up to 27 minutes here, so I don't want to continue this first introductory thing. Care responds to need as well. And we need to be careful how we express this. And Nell Noddings contrasts her own work with Alan Bloom's The Closing of the American Mind. I remember when that came out. It came out while I was in university, and there was a lot of debate about it. And if you go back and you look at the archives of the University of Calgary newspaper, The Gauntlet, you'll see some of that debate, and we had some of that debate in our offices. And Bloom says there's no real education that does not respond to felt need. Okay, fair enough. But what Bloom says is that in his way of identifying the needs, they must be, quote, the permanent concerns of mankind. In Noddings' comments, he claims to know what the needs are before he meets his students, because he knows the unchanging quality of human nature. Well, this whole question of human nature is going to come up again and again. We've already touched on it, right? Nature versus nurture. Well, here it is again, but from the other side. So their care does respond to a need, but the criticism here is that Bloom is just simply coming up with whatever this need must be from human nature. He's not alone. If you think of Maslow's hierarchy, for example, we're looking also at a pyramid of needs based on some story about human nature. And this leads us into a rhetoric of solving problems. because that's what Bloom is doing, right? He's solving the problem, he's meeting the need, and similarly, and this is from a review of Maria Puig de la Bellacasa. We're urged to resist the rhetoric of playing the game of solving problems by responding to any question in standard ways or by pretending that our particular research is not related to the textures of more than human worlds it is situated in. Kind of an awkward quote. Sometimes the writing generally is pretty clear in all of these authors, way unlike, say, Kant. But sometimes you get some awkwardness because they're writing from a perspective often of critical theory. But, there is this tendency to want to address problems with a theory or with a set of ideas or with a model that is pretty general, in standard ways. And so if there's a problem, whether it's academic malpractice, poverty, racism, whatever, you take your formula, you apply it to it. That's the model, right? And Puig de la Bellacasa is telling us, no, we need to resist and confidently resist the rhetoric of playing that game of solving problems. And it's a tough risk. It's a tough game to not play. Because people want you to solve problems. They, and the whole model of a theory is that you come up with a hypothesis or a generalization which is confirmed through evidence and tested through prediction. And the whole idea here is that you then apply it to new situations. In artificial intelligence, this is also an objective, and it's called transfer, where you're transferring the knowledge from one domain into another domain. And maybe that's possible, but the idea of creating an abstract entity like a model and using that to transfer, that's less clear that you can do it. And at the very least, here, the idea is that we can't just pretend that the particular situation that we're applying it to doesn't matter. Our particular research is directly related to the textures of whatever we're researching, and it isn't just going to transfer over. The ethical concept of care works against that tendency. Wikipedia's definition sort of gets at this, although as an aside, the discussion of Wikipedia on the ethics of care, and especially on the writers in this field, is uniformly not nearly as good as the coverage in other areas. And I'm sure the editors of Wikipedia know this, and maybe they don't care. And this imbalance on the part of Wikipedia has been noticed in the past and documented by people other than me. But I will say this. We can quote from Wikipedia here. The ethics of care is a normative ethical theory that holds that moral action centers on interpersonal relationships and care or benevolence as a virtue. Now, that definition clearly is coming out of the terminology and the taxonomy of the other ethical theories, right? And not coming from within the perspective of care itself. But what's important here is that it draws out the concept of interpersonal relationships as core to care. Some of the assumptions of the theory: persons are understood to have varying degrees of dependence and interdependence on one another. Other individuals affected by the consequences of one's choices deserve consideration in proportion to their vulnerability. That's way too mathematically expressed. Nobody's measuring proportions. And then situational details determine how to safeguard and promote the interests of those involved. Now again, here we're treating the vulnerable person as a passive recipient of care, but that's not the concept. Care is based on relationships. Care is based on a mutual exchange between the carer and the cared for. And that's what the important thing about care is. It's not that you get moral points that by acting as a carer. It's not that caring is part of virtue, as in a virtue theory, the way we discussed before. It's more about the concreteness of the relationship and the concreteness of the interests of those involved. That these are things that you cannot simply abstract away from. Well, you could, but if you did, you couldn't apply that theory to a new context, because those things are still going to matter. So now, one of the originators of ethics of care, and I'll say one of, because I'm not sure who was first, and it doesn't matter. Carol Gilligan was responding to Kohlberg's 6 stages of moral development. Now, Kohlberg, as well as Gilligan, are both working within the context of cognitive psychology, and they're both influenced by Piaget. So they're thinking of stages of development, stages of moral development, and they're thinking in terms of more or less developed. Now that's not where the distinction comes from. What happened is Gilligan looks at Kohlberg's work describing these stages and says a couple of things. First of all, that Kohlberg is interviewing exclusively 11-year-old boys to develop his theory. And secondly, that women can only go so far in his 6 stages and then stop. And don't get to the point of being an authority, or considering individual rights, or abstract reasoning and creating ethical principles. And that seems wrong, and it is wrong, right? Who would do a theory of moral development and interview only boys? So her work is a reaction to that, and in a different voice she expresses that reaction. And instead of the ethic of justice that we see in Kohlberg, Gilligan is presenting a kind of moral reasoning based on an ethics of care, which she says is developed primarily through a woman's voice. And so the stages of care for Gilligan basically are 3. Care for the self is the first stage, and then care for the other is the second stage, and then care for both, or a balanced sense of care, would be the highest stage. And she writes, women are more likely to make moral decisions based on issues of care, inclusion, and personal connection, rather than on a more abstract and distant notion of justice. So that takes us to the felt need, and that's where we'll wrap up this part of the presentation. We talked earlier about felt need as being identified by people like Bloom as found in human nature, and so you can identify, this is the need, this is what everyone has. For Gilligan and for others who follow an ethics of care, they're based on a recognition of needs, relation, and response. So it's based on the actual consideration in the actual voice of the people who are impacted by whatever decisions are made. And this would include the person being cared for, but is not necessarily limited to the person being cared for. For example, we might ask a question, is it moral to steal bread to feed my wife, who otherwise is starving? And, a theory of justice response might be, yes, it is moral, because life is far more valuable than mere possessions. And that's kind of a nice calculated way of doing it. An ethics of care, though, would ask questions like, well, how would this influence the relationship between you and your wife? What would she think of you after? And what are the longer term consequences if you're arrested and sent to prison the way Jean Valjean was in Les Miserables, and you're gone for 20 years? How's that going to affect me? And what are the impacts on the wider community? What is the impact on the person who depends on selling bread for a living? Because that person, too, is almost certainly not rich. It's not, we think, well, yeah, no, they can just do without the bread, but, it's going to have an effect on them. So all of these things come into play. And as we'll talk more about in the next section, it's not just whether I think these things come into play, right? And we're not doing mental exercises here. It's based on their expressed needs. It's based on our actually having conversations with the person being cared for and possibly other people in the community so that they can express their needs, because they are the ones that are in a position to say what they are. Anytime I come up with some idea of what somebody needs, there's going to be some guesswork here. The more authoritative person to do that is going to be the person whose needs I am addressing. Doesn't mean I agree with them. Doesn't mean they get carte blanche. I'm not a servant, but it means they get expressed. And then we have a conversation. And we take into account my needs, their needs, the wider needs of community, and we come up with an approach that is appropriate for these circumstances. Okay, I'm going to end this one here, but don't go away. We're going to have a part 2. We're only 1/5 of the way through this, to me, fascinating discussion. So talk to you soon.